Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for being here today and welcome. I know a couple people are still coming in, but we just want to say thank you for being here. Before we get started, we just want to make sure that you put your names in the chat and also place your institution affiliate or your institutional affiliation as well, please. Welcome to our spring semester of Civic Dialogues. We're happy to welcome new and returning attendees, and I see some new folks here today, so welcome. I'm Patty Robinson, Faculty Director of Civic Engagement at College of the Canyons, and I'm joined here today by Jan Connell, who is an emeritus and adjunct instructor at Cerritos College and 3CSN facilitator. And we also typically have Kimberly Rosenfeld here, but Kimberly, also from Cerritos, is not able to join us today, but she has been a huge component of this series. And we're also wanting to thank 3CSN folks, Keelan Koenig and Rebecca Moonstone, who is here today. And again, thank you for her assistance. We began our Civic Dialogue series in fall 2020. For those of you who aren't familiar with the series, it really was an outcome of COVID. It was the start of an earlier Bringing Theory to Practice grant, and it continues today as part of a second Bringing Theory to Practice grant called The Way Forward. I also want to say that when this series started, we as a group, and this group was an intersegmental group from the community college system and from the Cal State system, we wanted to try and foster a greater understanding of civic learning and democratic engagement. And one way that we were able to do this, and particularly because of COVID, was to create a series through a virtual format. And that's exactly what we've done. And we've done this bringing together some of the nation's leading scholars, researchers, and practitioners who are working in the world of civic learning and democratic engagement. Our presentations are recorded and they are being archived by 3CSN. So this is a great opportunity for you to always go back and preview earlier presentations. Today's presentation is comprised of two parts. The first part includes our guest speaker. You have the opportunity to write questions in the chat. You also have questions, or you can also unmute yourself when we get to that part of the presentation to ask Dr. Finley questions directly. The second component after the 12 o'clock hour is that Jan and I will then move everyone in, or excuse me, at 11 o'clock. I'm sorry, I'm getting my time zones mixed up here. At 11, we will move into our deep dive. And so those of you who would like to stay on and talk a little bit more in depth about Dr. Finley's presentation, that's the second hour. And then lastly, just our guiding framework. So keep this in mind as we go through today's presentation. We're advancing an understanding of the intersection between equity, agency, and civic engagement to promote the public good. We're recognizing civic, community, and democratic engagement as a high impact practice that's tied to guided pathways and student success. And finally, we're also leveraging participants' knowledge to build capacity and to innovate for local, global social change. And so with that, it's a great honor to welcome Dr. Ashley Finley as our second speaker for this spring series. Dr. Finley is the Vice President of Research and is the Vice President of Research and Senior Advisor to the President for the American Association of Colleges and Universities. She was previously the Senior Director of Assessment and Research at AAC&U and also National Evaluator for the Bringing Theory to Practice project. Most recently, she served as the Associate Vice President for Academic Affairs and Dean of the Dominican Experience at Dominican University of California, where she implemented a comprehensive framework for student learning and success centered around high impact practices, including holistic advising and e-portfolios. Dr. Finley's research and campus consultations focus on connecting best practices for program implementation, assessment design, and equity with institutional outcomes for student success and strategic planning. A significant component of this work at the campus and national levels has focused on the connection of students' personal development, such as resilience, belonging, identity, and sense of purpose with their learning and civic engagement. She has published a number of articles, book chapters, and monographs, including Assessing Underserved Students, Engagement in High Impact Practices with co-author Tia McNair, Civic Learning and Teaching, assessing underserved students' engagement in high impact practices, and well-being, an essential outcome for higher education. Prior to beginning her national work, Dr. Finley was a faculty member in the Department of Sociology at Dickinson College. She received a BA from the University of Nebraska at Lincoln and an MA and PhD, both in sociology from the University of Iowa. So with that, it's a great honor to welcome Dr. Finley.
Thank you. Thanks so much. Thanks so much, Patty. Wow, you chose the long form of the bio. Okay. All right. Thank you so much for that. Thanks to Patty. Thank you, Jan. Thanks to Kimberly Rosenfeld for the invitation to do this. I love this series. I think it's just a brilliant idea. So every once in a while, something crosses your desk as an invitation, and you're like, wow, I just want to be part of that. It's such a good idea. So I'm just really delighted to have the opportunity to talk with you. And today brings together two of my favorite topics, which is civic engagement and assessment. And starting in my work back with bringing theory to practice, thinking about these kinds of topics as at the time, it feels like a long time ago, a young faculty member, pretty eager to get engaged and eager to get into a national conversation. I learned really early on, what are the tricky elements of doing exactly this thing that propels us, that adds such a lift and a flavor to the way in which we envision teaching and learning and equity, but immensely tricky to think about what does it mean to do that well and what does it mean to succeed. I frankly love those questions. I love those questions as a sociology, guided by the inquiry process, which is exactly what so many of our disciplines are doing. All of our disciplines do. So I very much approach it from that lens. I think what you're going to hopefully see over the next hour or so that we're together is it's not about the assessment. This is a talk ostensibly about assessment, but I hope you walk away with it thinking that assessment has to be situated properly, and that is as a means to an end. So I'm going to hopefully poke some holes at what we think about are the endpoint or points of direction, or highlight what we think are the endpoints, because even those endpoints may not be exactly what you think of them to be. And I guess before I launch into what I think is probably way too many slides, and I will just admit that, I got really excited and wanted to kind of cover a bunch of things, but I do promise that I want us to be engaged in a dialogue as we go along here. So very much as Patty said, if you've got questions, huge thanks to Rebecca for keeping an eye on the chat. If you've got questions, please drop them in. You're not gonna distract me with your questions. I would love to stop at any point and engage your questions. I promise I won't privilege my content over our collective learning and opportunity to dialogue together. So with that, I will go ahead and share my screen. And I was thinking, just by way of getting started, I always like to kind of at least give some bit of an overview, but my goodness, it's at that point in the semester, right? It kind of feels like we ought to keep it simple. So this is my attempt at we should keep it simple here. I did want to take just a little bit of time and give some background on what AAC&U does. I think I didn't at all want to assume you're familiar with our work. You all have busy lives and busy careers. And even myself as a faculty member, I would get emails from AAC&U and have absolutely no idea who they were. So I wanted to take a minute and just give you a little bit of background on the association and why it's so connected to the topic that we're talking about today. I wanted to spend, beyond that, I want to spend just a little bit of time about making the case for why it's so important to have an evidence base for connecting with civic engagement. I increasingly find that we lack that. I've increasingly found that or faculty don't know where to look or how to support what is often and can be intuitive, that this is the best way to teach, that we can't imagine a learning space that doesn't have a community-based element to it. But sometimes we lack the theory behind it, or at least some of that evidence base. I want to tell you that there's a lot out there and there's a lot to draw upon. So I just didn't want to skip that piece. I think it's connected to what is really kind of an overall lens of let's build evidence. for why these practices are successful. And then 3 and 4 are really about kind of what I think about is getting into the guts of the problem or the heart of the matter. What guides the kind of assessment that we will do? What are those questions of why that compel us? And then a little bit of the how in terms of both an approach to what makes these practices good, and then also how we might think about the ways in which we assess in more complicated and generative ways. So just to give a little bit of background, this is a very, very tight little mission statement for AAC&U. Our mission is to advance the vitality and public standing of liberal education by making quality and equity the foundations of excellence for democracy, or in service to democracy. What's really critical about that definition in my mind is what the heck is a liberal education? And a liberal education is a philosophy of learning. So different from the liberal arts, encompasses the liberal arts, but is not constrained to them. So it is the philosophy of learning that suggests, regardless of where a student studies or the discipline in which they study in, they should have access to an education that equips them with the skills and the abilities and capacities to navigate and solve the enduring problems of our time. Plainly, in an increasingly global, complex, and diverse world, that is absolutely essential. So that philosophy and who students are in that space really commits to a kind of holistic framing of what learning looks like. And that is both certainly who a student is in the classroom, but a huge part of it is who students are outside the classroom. I'll say even a little bit more about that, but that is fundamentally what we are about. Here's just even like a quick example. If you hear anything, if we are beating any drums at AAC&U, it is that students have to be at the center of all of our processes. So we are situating their learning and their success at the center of what we do. We deal primarily with curricular change, but we talk an awful lot and increasingly about the co-curriculum, mostly as two parts of the whole, right? And really think, and I think for nothing like a conversation like this, do we have to think about how those two halves, if you were going to do it that simply, must come together. But we very much come at our work primarily through the work of curricular change. And then absolutely to think about preparation for students to flourish in their lives, careers, and certainly I forgot the other C here, their careers and communities, 100%. This is just a snapshot. When AAC&U started, we are an association that's over 100 years old. We were started in 1915. We started as AAC. So we were the Association of American Colleges. In the mid 90s or early 90s, we added the U to acknowledge our expanding membership to include universities. And so we were since the early 90s or so, we were the Association of American Colleges and Universities. And as Patty got right, just in the last few months, we have undergone another name change. Now we are the American Association of Colleges and Universities, hopefully keeping our same acronym, but the switching of those words matters tremendously. We have increasingly become an international association. We have increasingly become focused in terms of our strategic work on what it means to support students' global learning and to think about how all of our work is contextualized in a global setting. So it felt important for us, both in terms of our membership, the actual composition of our membership, but then also just even the root of what our work looks like to acknowledge that. We are very proud of the diversity of our membership. Our sort of sub tagline is, we are the only higher ed association united by an idea. We serve every sector and every stakeholder type. Yes, we serve some more than others, but ostensibly and practically our convenings draw a large and diverse range of perspectives and positionalities on campus, and we're tremendously proud of that, as you can see from this. We have always worked with 2- and 4-year institutions, public and private, our work has increasingly focused on what's happening within two-year institutions, technical colleges, et cetera. I think some of the most, I will tell you all plainly, because I know our population is primarily composed of two-year institutions. I will tell you plainly, I think some of the most innovative work happening in higher education is happening at community colleges, technical colleges, 100%. Part of when we say what is our membership organized by, or what's the kind of backing or translation of what a liberal education is, we point to our essential learning outcomes framework. And the context of this framework in our discussion today is important for pointing out that, so back in 2007, when this was released, we are now in the process of updating this framework. Lots of changes at AAC, great time to have this conversation. We are now in the process of updating this because, again, it's been about 15 years. We are now that campus that we look at and say, might be time to update those, might be time to look at the world around you and see if those need to be modified at all. This is our essential learning outcomes framework. This has been widely adopted across higher education. Not wholesale, not every single one of these, but the categories are very important. The goal areas are quite significant, because when this came out in 2007, and what it has been a guiding source of is reminding campuses that while we care about knowledge, we are not exclusively in the knowledge delivery business anymore. And I would say increasingly we are not in that business. Knowledge is everywhere. Access to knowledge is everywhere. You are no longer the holders, the exclusive holders of knowledge, right? So it has actually become increasingly incumbent upon higher education institutions of all types to help students parse knowledge, to help students do something with it, to interrogate it, right? And to create new knowledge. So that shifted a focus to saying what other kinds of goals organize the work that we do in higher education. And there's a whole background of even how we came up with this framework, largely driven by a massive research study of both our member institutions and then the wider world, the wider landscape of employment, disciplinary societies, a number of sort of other kind of forces of saying what sort of matters both for students' learning and their future success. So we had a goal area related to intellectual and practical skills. But then what you see there, and again, sort of situated for our conversation today, an acknowledgement that when we are helping students to succeed and when we're providing them with a liberal education, that's a lot about their personal and social responsibility. We don't just want to create educated beings. We want to create whole beings that play a role within their communities and contribute to society. We are not going to make assumptions about how they should do that, but that we are going to equip them with the capacities to act however they choose to. And then the fourth category of integrative and applied learning, you see a big hole there, and that's because I want to assert that probably one of the biggest changes that we'll make with the upcoming revision to our learning outcomes framework is the addition of a fifth category for goals, for mindsets, aptitudes, and dispositions. A explicit acknowledgement of the research, of what we know from our own practices, of what we've known in terms of supporting equity and student success, that what you see on the screen here, that capacities such as self-confidence, self-awareness, sense of purpose, sense of flourishing, growth mindset, belonging, these are all critical things to how we support students' learning and success and their ability to flourish. And we know that those are a huge part of it, and we know we needed to be more explicit about those. So we have added those, or we will be adding them. So that's what will be a public comment period on this framework. And we hope to, from public comments, actually arrive at what becomes the best set of language for describing that. But that category will probably would definitely be in there. So just a couple of quotes here. I like these because I always like the translation of what a philosophy is, and I think these two people kind of nailed it at very different times and with very different kinds of perspectives and backgrounds. Alexander Michael Johns is an educational philosopher who began an experimental college at the University of Wisconsin back in the early 1900s, and he's got this great quote. Had this great quote about literally what a liberally educated person was, and someone who is trying to understand what is happening to him in the midst of the civilization in which he lives. I love that quote always, but I really love it when we're talking about civic and community engagement. What does it mean to talk about making sense of the world right now? And I would absolutely say that for the context of this conversation, and I've said it a number of times, I can't imagine a campus out there that wouldn't be looking again at its civic mission and thinking about the ways in which that holds up right now, or the ways in which they are supporting that work right now. We've never, you don't need me to say it, but we've never been at a more critical time. And I love Michael John's quote for doing that. Maya Angelou always said it all, always had so many amazing things to say. But I love this one. In so many ways, segregation shaped me and education liberated me. This is the heart of what a liberal education does. The root of the word liberal is libere, which is to free. And that is what we're after. It is the freeing of the mind to equip students with the capacity to act and to think for themselves. And again, there could not be a better time for that, or to take that more seriously. So that's why I wanted to offer just a little bit in terms of background and of what lens we very much bring to this. You will see at the very end of our time together, I'm going to tell you a little bit about a project that we're working on at AAC&U, and hopefully by having a little bit of a background of who we are as an association, that kind of work will hopefully make some sense to you, or hopefully, I hope you'll think that's exactly who should be doing that work. So, but you can't do it without that sort of background. So just quickly, in terms of, and it'd be an opportunity to engage you in the chat here. I'm curious, this is a kind of, I don't want to say standard, but this is a list of high impact practices. This is not an exclusive list. This is not the only list. There are certainly other high impact practices that are not on this list. This just tends to be the most popular, the ones that are most pervasive, the ones that we know the most about in terms of research. There's a number of reasons it's this list, but we always want to say and make sure people know that it's not the only things that can be a high impact practice. I'm curious though, which of these would you point to as the community-based ones, or the ones with civic engagement? Do you want to drop into chat? What if you were doing a curriculum design, for example, and wanted to engage students more intensively in community-based, community-focused work? Which of these would you choose? Okay, service, community-based, yes. Internships, capstone, senior projects, Patty. All of them could work. Learning communities, diversity, global learning. Yeah, there, there it goes. I don't mean it as a gotcha question. I really don't. I wanted to invite you to think about, as we talk about assessment of civic engagement, what exactly are we assessing? It never ever means, for example, that I'm necessarily showing up on a campus and we're only assessing their service learning program or their community-based research program. I can't tell you, and it probably won't come as a surprise for this group. I do always think I'm preaching a little to the choir, but it won't surprise you that internships are almost never considered part of civic or community-based experiences. Even potentially undergraduate research to some degree, even though there's some citizen science is probably one of the coolest practices out there. Yes, I do think there is a kind of reconfiguration of thinking about what would it mean if community-based, community-focused, however you want to put it, civically engaged, and you'll see me use that language almost interchangeably. I do that strategically as much as out of habit. I just don't want to split the difference on how we talk about these things, but you could really see how it could easily be infused in every single one of these, right? It's just about how we design that practice, but it has major implications for sure about assessment and what we think is going to happen with the work. The one I would absolutely add is, and one for us to consider, particularly in terms of commitments to equity, access to high impact practicing, is advising and mentoring programs. I think those are, if I was going to pick one that's probably emerging to be on this list, I would say it's that, or project-based learning also could have major implications for community-based work. So I wanted to show you, again, this is very much in the making the case, and didn't want to assume what sort of studies have come across your desk. You're all reading things. I think it's an occupational hazard that we get, you know, that we read a lot. And so sometimes it's hard to read more. So I just wanted to put a couple of things in your line sight for how you can make the case for why community-based work is so important, and come at it a couple of different ways. Just very quickly, I'm going to show you two studies that are readily available online. This first one is a study that I did. It's feeling like an oldie but a goodie. This was a number of years ago, but I did it with Tia McNair, who's our Vice President for Student Success at AAC&U. And we were really after assessing underserved students' engagement and the impact of high impact practices for their learning. We really wanted to target students of color, first generation, transfer students, and really see how these practices differed. I'm actually not going to show you those data. They're in the report, but because I think there's something even that as significant as that is, there's something just even getting your head around the general impact of high impact practices. We had the equity piece, but what we ended up doing that was a little like unexpected for us was we talked about the cumulative impact of high impact practices. And so if, again, you take seriously the idea that community or civic engagement could be embedded in any high impact practice you do, thinking about cumulative effect becomes almost essential. But I can tell you, up until we did this study, and I'm not overstating it, that had almost never been looked at. Just the idea that what happens if a student has 3 of these? What happens if they have 5? And increasingly, well, let me ask you, I'll ask you another thing, just make sure you're awake. So looking at that list, this list, not so don't include advising mentoring. Don't include it because that's not official. But of the 11 that you see there, how many would you say that you do on your campus? And that's of course always limited to what you know your colleagues are doing, and you know that people are actually talking to each other. But to the best of your knowledge, how many do you think you're doing on your campus? Man, wow. It's always interesting to see what, at least half. Rachel. Any others? Any 2? Okay. Tony's saying 2 or 3 only. All right. Okay. Still more than one. You know, and I could also see, you know, how you might say to yourself, well, are we doing this at scale? Are we doing this at some level of scale? Or are we just doing it here and there? Okay. So pretty good indicators, right? And I think this was increasingly the case, and certainly the experience of talking with campuses is that most campuses aren't doing just one of these. They're not only doing first year seminars, for example. So it became that was sort of a compelling early question for Tia and I in doing this study. So we worked with the National Survey of Student Engagement. Yes, we were just looking with 4-year institutions on this one, but there's some terrific work out there around 2-year institutions and the work out of CESI as well. But for this, we used the National Survey of Student Engagement. We looked at these 6 because those 6 high impact practices are covered in that survey. These are the outcomes. I will tell you, just for the sake of convenience, and for this morning, those scales, deep learning, gains in general education, et cetera, are 0 to 100. That's how they were measured at that time. It's actually changed since then, but at the time it was like blissful. It was the easiest thing in the world. There's a number of questions, but they all add up to 100 at the end of the day. So you get some score between 0 and 100. So much fun. So we looked at, to start, we said, okay, well, what if we looked at individual ones? So a student who was in a learning community compared to a student who had not been in a learning community, on average, across those 4 scales, 0 to 100, how much higher on average were their self-reported gains? And so you can see that across the board here. And you can see, for example, service learning and student faculty research having tippy top almost. All significant differences for sure, but those levels of engagement were very high for students who had not engaged in those same things. But of course, I just told you that the compelling case to be made was, what happens if you just start adding them up? So any 2 of these together, any 3 of them, 4, 5, and then who has all 6, right? What happens? So let me show you this. I'm a quantitative sociologist by training. I have never had data that looked like this. This was a very exciting moment for me. It hasn't happened since, and it got much messier from here. It gets much messier when you start to look at the equity data, but this was a compelling foundation. If we looked at, so now you see the outcome scales at the bottom, again, 0 to 100. And so here are the students, the average score of students who self-reported having 0 of those 6 experiences. Here's what's happened when it was 1 to 2, 3 to 4, 5 to 6. Pretty stunning. Now, if you look at gains in personal and social responsibility at the end, you're right to notice that those perceptions are lower. Those are really the civic scales, the civic scale of students of how they feel better prepared to engage in their community, to put it sort of bluntly. Yeah, we could definitely have more of a conversation about why that scale lags, but nevertheless, a huge endorsement for thinking about the assessment that you're doing on your campuses. To what degree do you know it's cumulative? And as a colleague rightly pointed out, as soon as we put out this report, it was a great comment, and it's haunted me ever since. She said, well, that's, interesting data, Ashley, super glad you guys did this. You can't actually see what happens if students have multiple of the same experience. And she was absolutely right. And we know that students might encounter, for example, multiple service learning experiences. So we didn't have a way to actually gauge that. Something for continuing research. And since ours was in 2013, I wanted to make sure that you all were aware of this report that just came out in 2021. Same foundations. In fact, I talked to this team, this research team, Valentine, Price, and Yang. We talked a lot about what Tia and I had done, and they really wanted to replicate some elements of it. So everything we just did is great foundation for this. Here's what they did that was super smart. They took those 6 things, those 6 high impact practices, and divided them, split them in 2 between the ones that basically happen on campus and the ones that basically happen in communities, and compared them. I saw their report and I was, oh, dang it, that's smart, super smart, so that they could compare, right? So if it's a community-based hip, learning communities, what happens when you actually compare like the groupings of community-based ones? They also were smart enough to look at effect sizes, which have some interesting interpretations, more complex interpretation, but overall, you're seeing higher effects. So everything's significant. They had a huge sample size, as did Tia and I. Everything's significant, but they saw even stronger effects with community-based high impact practices. I love this study. I think it's super smart, a great one to think about how you make the case with this kind of work. So even if you talk about high impact practices, thinking about what's happening with those community-based practices. So a couple of other pieces that I just wanted to point to in terms of where we make the case and where we still need to make the case a little bit more. This is from AAC&U's most recent employer study. It goes back to those skills of a liberal education. We always want to reinforce that these are skills that are valued by employers. You see civic skills way at the bottom. in terms of what they value in new hires and new college graduates, what they think is very important for them to have. I would point out, and here's where I think we have a language issue or a language barrier. We have working with teams topping the list, and you've got ethical judgment somewhere right in the middle. We have some indications that I think that we have civic skills in the mix. They're just not called civic skills by employers. But I mean, I live in Washington, D.C., folks. Like I think teamwork's a pretty important civic skill, and one that we could absolutely reinforce. And by the way, working with teams to employers is working with diverse team members. So that notion of perspective taking is really critical, and that has come out consistently in our employer studies. This is actually from a different report, but most recent around campus stakeholders and the outcomes most identified by campuses. And you see, again, civic skills way low. These are by campuses. This is by stakeholders on campus. So again, I don't know if people are mostly responding to the language of civic skills. We'll explore that a little bit more, but I would say on the positive side, intercultural competence, very high. Ethical judgment, relatively high. So I'm hoping that as we keep thinking about and complicating the way in which we talk about these skills, we can make better connections to the practices that are happening. And I also wanted to lift up, because we're adding this mindsets, dispositions, aptitudes, and I think there's so many great connections, and I'm sure through your own work with the community-based work that you're doing, thinking about how those factors play into the work you're doing. I wanted to show you just briefly what we found by asking employers how they value these skills. The notions of drive, work ethic, ability to take initiative. I think if we hear anything from students, particularly around global abroad experiences or the discomfort that often comes with engaging with community, students do feel these heightened sense of awareness and self-confidence, their sense of their own abilities to do things. I think these are huge factors in connecting with those kinds of mindsets and dispositions, but we need to be much more explicit about what those things are. It's a similar list of valuing what is coming out of campuses. The lists are slightly different, but persistence and ability to take initiative for both employers and campus stakeholders, really critical. And so again, if you're wondering what my point is simply we need to make these things much more explicit. We need to stop treating them as fringe benefits of a process and become much more explicit about how we're evaluating those. Here's some good news. Here's some good news around what employers are saying and thinking, at least from our most recent study. We found for the first time, because we never looked at it this way before, the one way in which we disaggregated the data, and we did it by gender, race, region, industry type, and age. And the only place that we found consistent trend differences were between employers under the age of 40 and employers over the age of 50. And the very specific ways in which they were different were around primarily their valuing of civic and community-based experiences and skills, including the liberal arts. We found much significantly, in some places in the range of 30 percentage point differences in how employers under the age of 40 were valuing these skills. Or I should say actually valuing experiences for gaps that large. Employers under the age of 40 are the millennials, are the oldest millennials at this point. It's a really interesting point to be thinking about what generational shifts are awaiting us. And I think that's good news. From this most recent study, it would look like good news. So that might have felt like the why, but again, I just want to make sure you have that kind of evidence base for what you're doing. So if we come back to the work that you're doing and the way in which you envision how students might be civically or community engaged on your campus, how would you respond to this question? How should students be different by the end? I'm curious, how would you articulate that for students not just at the end of any one experience. I'm actually, in this question, I'm thinking about from the time they arrive on your campus to the time that they leave. How would you articulate that? Okay. So efficacy, ownership of their civic skills. That's great. But again, loved when I entailed the civic skills part. Agency. Yeah, that notion of empowerment, what students can do. Okay, growth, greater social responsibility. How do students envision that? Yes. Oh, clarity of goals is that's an interesting one in terms of their goals or external goals, or yes. Yeah, nice. A sense of interconnectedness. Yeah, it's another nice way of thinking about belonging and that kind of connectedness. In part, I wanted to ask this question. It's not the usual place that I would ask this question, quite frankly, in a conversation like this one. I wanted to ask it at this point because we're talking about assessment. And I wanted to set us up for a conversation about, well, how do you measure that? How do you think about, if we take seriously the things that you put in the chat and the idea of a trajectory, right? So the idea that if students come in and some amount of time, whether it's 2 or 4 years later, they leave that in your institution, how should they be different? So I'm inviting you very much to be thinking about cumulative effects. We do a lot of assessment of individual experiences. And if anything, I think can be helpful in these kinds of conversations, it's to think about and to be nudged to consider the whole. And how do you build out through collaboration to talk more about the whole? So part of the way in which I think that particular question gets situated of the why, right? Particularly after we've seen the essential learning outcomes framework, there's great endorsement of this range of skills. So what makes the difference, right, for an individual institution thinking about the question of why? And particularly around personal and social responsibility. I have long said that I've looked at a lot of outcomes lists, I've looked at a lot of mission statements, and if anything most stands out to me about a place, it is its civic mission. It is the way in which it even crafts the language of its outcomes or community-based outcomes for students. I get a sense of what that institution is. This is a picture. It's just simply one of my favorites. This is a picture from Gettysburg College down the road from us in Washington, D.C. I just love the juxtaposition of a great and historic battle from the 1800s up against the complexities and the problems that still persist to this day. Very different time periods, right? Very different ways of thinking. And what does it mean to still fight the same problems and to still think about what the root is of your civic mission as it changes and is necessarily contextualized over time? I think this picture captures that magnificently. And this is what I think, and I hope every campus is doing right now, is thinking about why the work is authentic to them. So thinking about, as you go about assessing something, as you go about asking questions of why, what makes that authentic? And asking some questions about, just as you see here, what is your history of your community-based position as an anchor institution? Maybe you've never been an anchor institution. What does that even mean? So your mission, who your students are now, right? What do they want? What questions are they asking? And certainly, of course, where the world is and how you help students to think about that. I do hope that as we think about the questions of why and how your responses to that question, that as best you can, you're not thinking in additive ways. It's really, and this is where I'll do one of my favorite lines is making the implicit more explicit rather than additive. So, I work with campuses all the time, like, faculty can't do one more thing. We can't add another layer of assessment to what they're doing. And for me, it's always about coming back to saying, well, you're already doing it, aren't you? Aren't you already doing these things? It's just that you haven't made them explicit, or you're assessing for a bunch of other things, but why are you assessing for the thing that matters? So thinking about where do practices exist? And I do think this is where, again, curricular, co-curricular come together. Asset mapping is very much, in particular around community-based experiences, really thinking about where practices even exist on campus, trying to get a handle on that so you can think together more cumulatively simply by knowing where everything exists. A needs assessment, easier said than done, but basically the idea of saying, what data are you missing? Are there things that you need better access to? It's simply unknown. Those are all ways of thinking about what needs assessment can do. And resource alignment is increasingly necessary on our campuses in resource scarce environments, but thinking about the ways, and I mean this both, not just from the money or resources it takes to do assessment, but frankly, what you're assessing in the first place. Resource alignment of the way in which we are running ourselves ragged, as my mom would say, to do so many things that are basically all rowing in the same direction, but we haven't taken the time to think about where alignments can happen. And so really considering how we do a better job of combining or simply working together. A great example of this are civic programs and community-based programs that exist in the academic affairs and exist in student affairs. Like can often be very similar programs, but just one's in academic affairs and one's in student affairs. Yeah, resource alignment, lots to say there. And certainly that a major component of the why question has to be focused on equity of what students, who has access to the high impact practices that you're doing. This was a big part of TNI's study too. There was actually a whole qualitative portion of that study where we ran focus groups on campuses, and a big thing that we asked students was, what limits your access to these? What prevents you or encourages you to become engaged? Thinking about equity focus in terms of the outcomes that you're seeking, and taking an asset-based mindset for not blaming students for what they are doing, but thinking about how do you provide the supports that allow all students to flourish, that embraces their backgrounds, embraces their rich traditions, the strengths that they bring to these equations and to these matters, and then supporting from there. That asset-based notion is just fundamental. So a few points on the why, and then I definitely want to turn it over to your questions. But part of where I knew we'd get in this conversation is a huge focus on outcomes, which makes sense. I mean, that's what we usually think about when, like, well, you're going to do assessment, so you're assessing what? You're assessing the outcomes. But a sneaky part of what has to come in with assessment and has to come into our conversations around high impact practices in general, but absolutely community and civic-based experiences, is that they're simply done well. If you don't have a handle on the degree to which your experiences are actually effective in terms of implementation, that there have been some conversations around what makes these good in the first place. You shouldn't expect great data. You wouldn't run a research study that way. It's the fundamentals of the methods. And it's as basic as this. When I first started as a faculty member, again, I said earlier, I was very eager, very excited to get engaged. And somebody in my department or somebody outside the department said, do you want to do a service learning course? Thought, I have no idea what that is, but that sounds fun. And that sounds like I teach social stratification, social inequality, and seems like we ought to be out in the community. I'm glad that's what you call it. So sign me up. And we had really basic questions. I remember talking to my faculty colleagues who did this, really basic questions about how many hours should they be out there? How many hours should they be working with the community partner? Now, I know many, many years later, that's the most superficial of questions we could have been asking, but at least it was something about quality. And now I also understand we did it all wrong. So having some sense of the conversation of what makes these practices effective is critical. Otherwise, you end up with something like this. This is straight from one of the focus groups that Tia and I ran. Love this quote. I remember the moment the student said this, and Tia and I looked at each other and said, well, there it is. It's all right there. I have teachers that take us out of the building. I don't know what it's called. They take you out of the building and you go learn about the vegetable gardens among the hmong. There are a lot of professors here that teach differently. Students don't use our language. It hardly matters to them. In fact, and what we found and what was the best part about doing this qualitative portion of the study was how consistently students resonated with the quality of the practices, with the essence of what these practices did. The name didn't matter at all to them. So just a nudge to say, these are the 8 sort of characteristics of high impact practices. I think part of the reason that community-based and civic experiences tend to get higher points on efficacy is because I think these kinds of things are almost endemic to those practices, whereas other kinds of practices, I think we work a little harder to get these things into them. That's my own hypothesis, but there is now some research teasing these out. But for your own purposes, and let me be clear about it, I am absolutely saying you need to assess for these things. That the assessment isn't just for the outcomes. It is about either your own self-reflection, your reflection as a department, and I would hope your reflection as an institution as a whole, delivering these practices that you're coming together and you're saying, to what degree are we asking students to put in significant amounts of time and effort? What does our structured reflection processes look like? Where are opportunities for that reflection and integration to happen? What are the levels of interaction? Any one of these, you could go through it. Do you have a community-based research symposium on your campus, for example? A great example of number 6. There are other ways too, but that's exactly what I'm suggesting in terms of encouraging greater levels of and different kind of methods of assessment. Another just fantastic way of thinking about fidelity of implementation, of how do you know it's being done well? I think this is a terrific place where not just global, sorry, but e-portfolios come in capturing a breadth of students' experience, in encouraging their structured reflection across those experiences. I'm going to show you 2 examples from Dominican University of California, where I helped lead an e-portfolio effort, and I learned so much, and I was just blown away by how students designed for themselves the structuring of what their learning process looked like. It was just an incredible thing to see. And here's just another one, and this is Stanford University has some great work around e-portfolios and how they encourage students' depth of thinking, exploration of selves, connections with broader concepts, and thinking about their own development. But you can see here, for example, it's just simply having a structured place to reflect on the things that we say matter to them, and then going looking for these examples are all public. I was actually clicking around on them in preparation for our discussion today, and it was really kind of fun to see some new examples. So in the most fundamental way, and I know we're kind of running short on time, but I really wanted to get to this point. Here's what I would say. If you be wary of any assessment person that starts with the tools, that starts with, well, you know what, I think you really just need a survey. Or, you know what, we should just run some focus groups. I would always be wary of that, because the tools of how you're conducting your assessment have to match the questions that you're asking, that you're after. Whether those are about outcomes, whether those are about fidelity of implementation, and even if they're about outcomes, what kinds of outcomes? At a point in time, over time, those are critical questions to be asking, and they absolutely depend upon the kinds of tools that you would use. So for example, and this is to be very quick, but I just want to show you different resources that are out there. If you're serious about mindsets, aptitudes, and dispositions, as I have been for a very long time, having worked with bringing theory to practice for a number of years, and now in my work with AAC&U, these are highly accessible outcomes. The world of positive psychology and the scholarship in positive psychology has been just tremendous in this. Sociologists have contributed as well. The University of Pennsylvania Positive Psychology Center has a terrific list of resources, but you cannot lack for tools in this regard. I promise you that. But what you see on even both sides of the slide here are really about articulation of why. Don't grab any instrument that's out there. There are plenty out there. It really matters what question you're asking. And is it meaningful for your campus? And the other really significant one I would go to, and I knew we'd come to this point in the conversation and we would have already talked quite a lot about cumulative effect, both of multiple practices, but over time as well. And when you begin to ask those kinds of questions, you need tools like portfolios can be very helpful, not essential, but very helpful. And something like a rubric that would assist you in framing out that cognitive development. And so this is really at the heart of what AAC&U's value rubrics are about. I'm, again, not assuming that any of you have even heard of these or maybe given a glancing look at them. This is the background for why they exist, is precisely around those kinds of questions. They are dense tools. I will absolutely admit that. But they are meant to get at these kind of core questions that we're asking around students' growth and development over time and the complexity of these skills. Lots more we can say with that if needed. Here's just a snapshot of our rubric initiative to date. These were launched in 2009, and you can see over 600,000 rubric downloads at this point. They have been, if not widely adopted, I would say widely looked at, right, for sure, and increasingly used on campus, specifically because we want to get better at actually measuring students' demonstrated learning. Just a quick example of the most often downloaded or used rubrics that we're seeing. So pretty interesting kind of snapshot. Yes, critical thinking, written communication, oral communication have definitely risen to the top. We also have conducted the most national work with those rubrics, so that's also a reason why. And we now have the value scoring collaborative. So we now have the ability for campuses to upload samples of student work, and they are scored by certified scorers at the national level. Faculty that have been trained and certified working with particular rubrics that then score that work, and data reports go back to campuses. We're very excited about this work in how it has supported the idea of developing national baselines for students' demonstrated learning. And you might be interested to know that almost half of all the rubrics basically half of all the rubrics that are in the collaborative right now, as we are just launching that platform, are around personal and social responsibility. So we're really excited about heightening campus's use of those rubrics and gathering data and evidence associated with it. One last thing that I wanted to add and let you know about is a civic evidence project that we've just launched at AAC&U. A few things, and I'll go a little quickly here because there's certainly background. We can talk about this more in Q&A. We have funding from Lumina Foundation that has allowed us to bring together 31 campuses across 12 states. College of the Canyons is one of those institutions. What those campuses are doing is actually the middle and then the end piece around professional development. Those campuses are gathering student work products related to their civic engagement, and they are going up to our value scoring collaborative and assessed. And effectively what those campuses are doing, I'll show you the map here. What those campuses are doing is building what will be the first national baseline around students' civic demonstrated levels or abilities around civic work and civic engagement. So most campuses have chosen to use the civic engagement rubric. A few at this point have used the global learning rubric. But this is the list of institutions, and as you're seeing there, we are working explicitly also with the state of Utah and all 16, 8 4-year and 8 degree technical colleges, 2-year institutions in Utah. So really excited about that work as well. So this is just a last slide in terms of reflection. I don't think I'd want to go into it. I always want to end with some questions for you to be thinking about in terms of next steps for your own campus. But I think I've been talking a lot, so let's just stop and open it up for your questions. I know you have more to synthesize in your breakout groups, but I'm happy to answer anything that's maybe was on your mind.
And please feel free to unmute where you can ask Ashley questions directly. So you don't have to write them in the chat if you'd like. I know, Ashley, this is amazing. I was taking down a bunch of notes as you were talking, and I think what just a lot of things really strike me, but I think a lot of your most recent studies, it's really, really interesting to see how this is starting to bubble to the top a little bit. And I particularly find that comment that you made about the generational differences.
Yeah.
That's really interesting.
Yeah, there's so much. I knew I already had too many slides and I didn't want to sneak in one more. But one of the questions that we ask employers is basically what high impact practices would make them more likely to hire a college graduate. So if you saw this list of experiences or any of these experiences on a resume or whatever, what would make you more likely to hire that person? And they all were sort of very likely internships, sort of the coin of the realm. But then when we disaggregated that one, the differences between so employers under the age of 40 were significantly higher on every experience, except for internships, because it's so high for everyone. But on every other high impact practice, employers under the age of 40 have valued those at significantly higher rates. And that's where, when students had a global learning experience or a community-based project, we were seeing differences in like the 20 or 30 percentage point difference, just massive differences. Yeah, it's juicy. We're going to keep following that one.
So Rachel is asking, okay, someone in the link report mentioned, and actually I think it's the report that you were just referring to. We can go back and find those. I know most of your reports, I believe, are easily found on the AAC&U website.
And I'll drop that link in here, and you'll find, and just for this, you'll find both the employer report. I cited our most recent stakeholder or campus report from faculty. It's surveying faculty, deans and directors and senior administrators. That one's also there.
And then Ashley, also the one with Tina Nair that you were referring to, that's also easily found on the
Yes.
site.
Yes. And we've just redone the website. It's prettier, and we hope it's easier to find stuff. But one of the things that's harder to find is some of the older reports. So if you can't find it, I actually think it's frankly been posted on so many other sites at this point. You might find it readily at some other place, but let me know if you can't find it. I'll make sure you can.
And then it looks like Melissa's asking, besides e-portfolios, what types of assessments were used in the different types of high impact practices?
Melissa, I just don't know if you mean for the, well, we didn't use e-portfolios for that either, but I don't know if in what context you mean for, or what can be used for assessing different types of HIPs. E-portfolios are good for assessment because e-portfolios are repositories of student artifacts. That makes them that's one of the reasons they're so good for assessment, because you have direct lines to students' work. And even if that work is reflective work, it's all just sort of held right there. But even then you need a tool to evaluate it. So we would always so that's one of the reasons that the value rubrics were created with some lens towards e-portfolios. They can certainly be used not with e-portfolios, but the idea was sort of like, hopefully e-portfolios are happening in the background here, but you need a tool that matches them, and that's where I would also encourage value rubrics. Other types of assessments are, you know, that is what we think is the most significant form of direct assessment. There's lots of other indirect assessments, right? And that's asking students their perceived learning. So that's the community college study of the CESI version of NSSE, or National Survey of Student Engagement. Locally developed surveys can be terrific. I just would always ask, again, I think when we make locally developed surveys, we tend to we're tending to be asking about quality of experience. Did you like the experience? Were you satisfied with the experience? I think they could be a little more heavy hitting. So even if you're using locally developed things, I would always say, what are the outcomes that this is supposed to be getting to? And that's why, if you're thinking about mindsets, there's plenty of tools out there. The Wabash study that I linked to is now defunct. It hasn't run in years, but it's still one of the best list of instruments I've seen. So it's just a great resource. I'll make sure send them to Patty and Jan. I'll make sure you have a copy of the slides so you can see what those resources are.
Ashley, we want to make sure we're